Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Let me start by saying my brother-in-law Greg has always been difficult. From the very first time my sister Rachel brought him to a family dinner 8 years ago, he rubbed everyone the wrong way. Greg isn't just your average, mildly annoying guy. No, he's the type who thrives on saying the most obnoxious thing in the room and then defending it with a smug grin and, what? I'm just being honest. And if anyone dares to dish it back, cue the sulking. He pouts, he glares, and sometimes he outright leaves, claiming he's been attacked for telling the truth. It's ironic, really, because Greg has zero problem dishing out his unsolicited opinions about anything and everything. How people dress, the food they eat, even how they parent their kids. Nobody in the family genuinely likes Greg. My dad outright avoids him. My mom, ever the peacemaker, brushes off his behavior with a tight smile and a change of subject. My wife, Mia, typically ignores him. On the rare occasion she does respond, it's with a cutting remark so sharp and effortless it leaves Greg floundering. My dad absolutely lives for those moments. The only person who seems oblivious to all of this is Rachel. She's been with Greg for so long, it's like she's blind to his flaws, or maybe she's just decided they don't matter. And to be fair, he's not all bad. He's a decent partner to Rachel. He doesn't direct his nastiness at her, and she always insists he's kind to her in private. But that doesn't erase the fact that he's a complete nightmare to the rest of us. Family gatherings with Greg always follow the same pattern. He starts with a few offhand comments, things that might not seem so bad if you don't know him. He'll tell my mom her cooking is a bit bland this time, or suggest that my dad's favorite car restoration project is a waste of time. When no one takes the bait, he gets bolder. By the time dessert rolls around, he's saying things that are downright cruel. Last Thanksgiving, for example, Greg thought it would be a great idea to tell Mia that her career in nonprofit work was cute, but probably didn't pay enough to be worth it. When Mia calmly pointed out that her job wasn't about money, Greg smirked and said, "Well, someone has to pay the bills, right?" I swear, my dad almost choked on his turkey from laughing when Mia responded, "I'd rather do something meaningful with my life than spend it stirring the pot just to get attention." But hey, to each their own. Greg didn't say much for the rest of the meal, which was a rare and beautiful gift. Things finally came to a head last weekend, though, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything that happened. The day started innocently enough. We were at my parents' house for one of our usual family gatherings. These happen every couple of months, a chance for everyone to catch up, eat good food, and let the kids run around the backyard while the adults relax. Mia, my dad, and I were all sitting in the corner, chatting about an upcoming car show when Greg decided to insert himself into the conversation. "Oh, another car show?" he said, rolling his eyes. "Don't you two ever get tired of wasting money on that junk?" Dad, who'd been talking about a 1967 Mustang he's been restoring, bristled. "It's a hobby, Greg. Not that you'd understand." Greg smirked, but before he could say anything, Mia changed the subject. "Rachel, have you decided what you're bringing to Christmas this year?" she asked, effectively shutting Greg down. For a moment, I thought we were in the clear, but Greg never lets things go. Later, when Mia and my dad stepped outside for a private conversation, Greg took it as a personal slight. "Why do they always get to sneak off together?" he muttered loudly. "Because they're close," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Greg scoffed. "Yeah, too close if you ask me. It's like Mia is trying to take Dad away from everyone else." That was when I realized this wasn't just a normal Greg day. This was a bad Greg day, and things were about to get a lot worse. To understand why last weekend hit so hard, you need to know about Laura. She was more than just Mia's best friend. She was like a sister to her. They met in high school and had been inseparable ever since. Laura was smart, kind, and fiercely independent, the kind of person who lit up a room just by walking into it. When she got pregnant with Ben, Mia was her biggest cheerleader, even stepping up as a godmother without hesitation. But 3 years ago, everything changed. Laura died suddenly in her sleep, the victim of an undiagnosed heart condition no one saw coming. It was a shock that rippled through all of our lives, but none more than Mia's. She was the one who found Laura, and the image of Ben crying in his crib after hours of being alone still haunts her. When no one in Laura's family was in a position to care for Ben, Mia and I didn't hesitate to adopt him. He's been our son ever since, but we make sure he knows who Laura was. We visit her grave every year, and Mia tells him stories about her, how much she loved him, how proud she was to be his mom. Last weekend marked the 3rd anniversary of Laura's passing, and as always, it was a somber time for our family. On Saturday, we visited her grave, leaving flowers, and sharing quiet moments of reflection. Mia doesn't talk much on these visits. She just kneels by the headstone, tracing Laura's name with her fingers while Ben chatters away about how he's doing in school or what he wants to be for Halloween. By the time Sunday rolled around, Mia was quieter than usual. These anniversaries always take a toll on her, but she has a way of keeping her emotions close to the chest. She didn't want to miss the family gathering at my parents' house. It's her way of staying connected and keeping things normal for Ben, but I could tell she wasn't entirely herself. I was determined to support her as best I could. I knew the day would be emotionally draining for her, even without Greg being, well, Greg. The first half of the gathering was uneventful. Mia and my dad, who have always been close, slipped outside for a walk, a habit they've developed whenever one or both of them need to clear their head. I stayed inside with Ben, chatting with my mom while he played with some old toys my parents keep around for the grandkids. Then Greg started in. "Where'd Mia and Frank go?" he asked loudly, glancing around the room like he was searching for a conspiracy. "They went for a walk," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. Greg raised an eyebrow. "What? They couldn't invite the rest of us?" "It's not like that," I said. "Mia just needed some air. Yesterday was the anniversary of Laura's passing, so she's having a tough weekend. Now, any normal person would have stopped there. Maybe they'd offer their condolences or change the subject. But not Greg. She should have gotten over that by now," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "It's been 3 years. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Even my usually diplomatic mom gave Greg a sharp look. But it was my grandfather, a quiet man who rarely speaks up during these gatherings, who finally broke the silence. "I lost my best friend over 20 years ago," he said softly. "And there are still days I miss him so much it hurts. You don't just get over something like that." Greg, for once, seemed at a loss for words. He muttered something under his breath and slouched back in his chair, but the damage was done. The mood in the room had shifted, and it was clear that most of us were barely tolerating him at this point. Mia and my dad returned a little while later, both looking more relaxed. I filled Mia in on what had happened, and she just shook her head, letting out a soft sigh. "Let's just get through lunch," she said quietly. I nodded, but deep down, I knew this was only the calm before the storm. What I didn't realize at the time was just how far Greg was willing to push things, and how ready Mia was to push back. At first, the gathering seemed like it might be one of the rare peaceful ones. Everyone was settled around the living room, chatting and nibbling on snacks while the kids played in the backyard. My mom, ever the gracious host, had made sure there were enough finger foods to feed a small army. Even Greg was keeping his usual snark to himself, though I suspected that had less to do with self-restraint and more to do with the fact that he hadn't found the right target yet. Mia had been quieter than usual, sticking close to me and my dad, who has a knack for making her laugh even when she's feeling low. At one point, Dad suggested they go for a quick walk around the block, a tradition they'd started years ago during one of Mia's first family gatherings when the chaos had overwhelmed her. It was their way of stepping out for some air and catching up, and it always worked. The moment they slipped out the front door, though, Greg decided it was time to stir the pot. "Why do they always get to sneak off together?" he asked loudly, his tone laced with mock indignation. "What's the big secret?" I felt my stomach tighten. "It's not a secret, Greg," I said, keeping my voice as even as possible. "Mia's just having a hard time. Yesterday was the anniversary of Laura's passing, so she needed a minute." Greg leaned back in his chair, smirking like he'd just caught me in a lie. "She should have gotten over that by now," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It's been 3 years. How long is she going to milk this?" The room went dead silent. Even the kids' laughter outside seemed to fade. My mom froze mid-reach for the cheese platter, her face a mixture of shock and disapproval. My dad's absence felt suddenly glaring. I knew he'd have had plenty to say if he'd been there to hear it. It was my grandfather, of all people, who broke the silence. He's not the type to get involved in family drama. At 78, he's more interested in keeping the peace than fueling the fire. But something about Greg's comment struck a nerve. "It's not something you get over," Grandpa said quietly, setting down his coffee cup. "I lost my best friend 25 years ago, and there are still days I miss him so much it hurts. You don't just move on from people you love." His words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke that felt heavier than any raised voice could have. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, muttering something under his breath that sounded like whatever. For once, he didn't have a snappy comeback. The rest of us tried to move on, but the mood had shifted. My mom busied herself in the kitchen, clearly looking for an excuse to avoid the tension. My sister Rachel, who had been pretending not to hear the conversation, suddenly found herself very interested in checking her phone. I was furious, but I kept it together for Mia's sake. She didn't need me escalating things when she was already having a tough day. Mia and my dad returned a few minutes later, looking more relaxed. I filled Mia in on what had happened, keeping my voice low to avoid drawing more attention. Her reaction was exactly what I expected. A resigned sigh and a shake of her head. "Let's just get through lunch," she said quietly, giving my hand a squeeze. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wasn't done. And I was right. Lunch started out fine. My mom's cooking was as good as ever, and the kids were thrilled to have dessert early for once. The adults chatted about harmless topics, upcoming vacations, holiday plans, and the latest antics of my cousin's overly dramatic cat. But Greg, true to form, couldn't stand being left out of the spotlight. It started with little things, interrupting conversations, making offhand remarks about how the food wasn't as good as last time. Typical Greg behavior. Most of us ignored him, but I could see Mia growing more tense with every comment. Finally, Greg turned his attention to Mia and my grandfather, who were quietly discussing plans for an upcoming trip to the Christmas markets. He leaned across the table, cutting them off mid-sentence. "Must be nice to have everyone fawning over you all the time," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I guess all you have to do is lose a friend, and suddenly you're the center of attention." The table went silent again, this time with a sharp edge. Mia looked at him, her face unreadable, and for a moment I thought she might ignore him. But then she set down her fork, folded her hands on the table, and said something I'll never forget. "If you want attention so badly, Greg," she said calmly, "why don't you just say that instead of being an ass about it?" The air left the room like a popped balloon. Greg's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. My dad, who had been watching from the other end of the table, let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, breaking the stunned silence, "I guess that's one way to tell someone to sit down and shut up." I couldn't help but laugh, despite the tension. But I also knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time Mia came back from her walk with my dad, I could see she was in a better mood. Whatever they talked about had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders, and she even managed a small smile when Ben ran up to show her the paper snowflake he'd made with my mom. Lunch was served soon after, and for a while, it seemed like the day might actually end on a high note. My mom's pot roast was a hit, and the kids were thrilled to have cupcakes for dessert. The adults kept the conversation light. Upcoming holiday plans, a new restaurant my mom wanted to try, and a funny story my dad told about a mishap at one of his car shows. Even Greg was quiet, though I suspected it wasn't because he'd had a change of heart. It was more like he was waiting, watching for an opportunity to make himself the center of attention. It didn't take long for him to find it. Mia and my grandfather had struck up a quiet conversation at the end of the table, talking about their shared love of Christmas markets. It's one of their favorite traditions, wandering through the rows of festive stalls, sipping mulled cider, and picking out handmade ornaments for the tree. Greg, who had been unusually quiet up until that point, suddenly leaned forward, cutting them off mid-sentence. "Must be nice to have everyone hanging on your every word," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Mia blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Greg said, louder this time. "It's always about you, isn't it?" Poor Mia, still milking the tragedy of her friend dying 3 years ago. When is enough enough? The room went deadly silent. My mom froze, her fork hovering midair. My dad set down his glass, so hard it clinked against the table. Even the kids, sensing the tension, stopped their antics and looked around nervously. I felt a wave of fury rise in my chest. But before I could say anything, Mia beat me to it. "We weren't even talking about Laura," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We were planning a trip to the Christmas markets." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But if you want to make this about you, Greg, let's talk." The shift in her tone was subtle, but unmistakable. The calm before the storm. Greg, oblivious to the warning signs, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. "Oh, here we go. Let's all tiptoe around Mia because she's so fragile." "It's pathetic." That was it. The calm broke. Mia set her napkin down and turned to face him fully. "You think I'm fragile?" she asked, her voice razor-sharp. "That's funny coming from a man who can't take a single ounce of criticism without throwing a tantrum." Greg's grin faltered, but Mia didn't stop. "Here's the thing, Greg. Nobody here likes you. The only reason you're even invited to these gatherings is because of Rachel. But every time you show up, you make it worse for everyone. You thrive on making people uncomfortable because it's the only way you know how to feel important." The tension in the room was so thick, you could have cut it with a knife. Mia wasn't done. You want to talk about Laura? Fine. She was a better person than you'll ever be. She made people feel valued and loved. She was the kind of person who made the world a little brighter just by being in it. That's why her funeral was standing room only, because she mattered. You'll be lucky if Rachel even shows up to yours. The color drained from Greg's face. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Mia stood up, smoothing her dress like she hadn't just dropped the verbal equivalent of a nuclear bomb. I'm done, she said, looking around the table. Sorry for ruining lunch. With that, she walked out to the backyard, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. It was my dad who broke the tension. He leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. Well, he said, I guess Greg just got told straight by a lesbian. The room erupted in nervous laughter, but I couldn't join in. My mind was racing, torn between pride in Mia for standing up for herself and dread over the fallout this was going to cause. Because one thing was clear, Greg wasn't going to let this go. The seconds after Mia's explosive exit felt like an eternity. The silence in the dining room was oppressive, broken only by the faint clink of silverware as my dad casually set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. He seemed more amused than shocked, but the rest of us? Stunned. Greg, for all his usual smugness and sharp tongue, looked completely blindsided. His mouth opened and closed as if trying to form a retort, but nothing came out. It was the first time I'd ever seen him speechless, and honestly, it was a beautiful sight. Rachel, sitting beside him, was the first to recover. That was completely uncalled for, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of outrage and embarrassment. Uncalled for, my dad shot back, raising an eyebrow. I'd say it was a long time coming. Greg finally found his voice, though it wasn't as steady as usual. I can't believe she would say something like that. To me, after everything I've done to try and fit into this family. That was too much for my mom, who had been sitting quietly, torn between her peacemaking instincts and her frustration with Greg. Fit in? She repeated, her tone incredulous. Greg, all you do is tear people down. You pick at every little thing. And when someone finally stands up to you, you act like you're the victim. Greg turned red, his anger bubbling to the surface. So what? You're all okay with her attacking me like that? Saying those things in front of everyone. Attack, my dad scoffed, barely able to hide his grin. You've been attacking everyone at this table for years. You just don't like it when someone punches back harder. Rachel, clearly trying to salvage the situation, placed a hand on Greg's arm. Let's just go, she said, her voice tight. But Greg wasn't ready to back down. No, I want an apology, he said, his voice rising. She humiliated me, and I'm not leaving until I get one. The rest of us exchanged looks, the kind of unspoken communication that only happens between people who've spent years enduring the same nonsense. It was clear to everyone, except Greg, that no apology was coming. Finally, my grandfather, who had been quietly sipping his coffee through the whole ordeal, set his cup down and spoke. You know, Greg, there's a saying about people who live in glass houses. Maybe you should think about that before throwing any more stones. Greg glared at him, but before he could respond, my dad stood up and clapped his hands. Well, this has been fun, he said with mock cheerfulness. But I think it's time for you two to head out. Frank, my mom hissed, clearly torn between her role as host and her frustration with Greg. What? Dad said, shrugging. If they're so unhappy here, why stay? Rachel looked like she wanted to argue, but Greg grabbed his jacket and stood up, muttering something about how we'd regret this. After they left, the tension in the room finally started to dissipate. My dad let out a low whistle and shook his head. Well, I didn't see that coming, he said, looking at me. Does Mia always have that in her? Or was this a special occasion? I couldn't help but chuckle. She doesn't usually need to go that far. But Greg? He earned it. My mom sighed, rubbing her temples. I just don't know what we're supposed to do now. Rachel's going to be furious, and you know she's going to spin this like Mia's the bad guy. She can spin it however she wants, my grandfather said firmly. The truth is, Mia was right. Greg has been a thorn in everyone's side for years. She just had the guts to say what the rest of us were thinking. My dad grinned, raising his glass. Here's to Mia, he said. The rest of us raised our glasses too, though my mom hesitated before joining in. When I went outside to check on Mia, I found her sitting on the back porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked calm, but I could tell she was still processing everything that had just happened. You okay? I asked, sitting down beside her. She let out a long breath. I don't know. I probably shouldn't have said all that, but I just couldn't let him get away with it anymore. He crossed the line. You didn't just stand up for yourself. I said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You stood up for everyone. And trust me, nobody in there thinks you were wrong. Mia leaned into me, a small smile tugging at her lips. Maybe, but I'm guessing this isn't the last we'll hear about it. She wasn't wrong. The fallout was just beginning, and Greg, he wasn't going down quietly. Greg's face was a deep shade of red, his eyes darting around the table as if searching for someone, anyone, to come to his defense. But the room was eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of the kids playing in the backyard. No one said a word, either too stunned or too relieved to break the silence. My dad was the first to speak, his voice laced with amusement. Well, he said, leaning back in his chair, I guess Greg just got told straight. By a lesbian. The tension snapped like a rubber band. My grandfather let out a chuckle, and my cousin quickly covered her mouth to hide her laughter. Even my mom, who normally plays the role of peacemaker, failed to suppress a smile. Greg, however, was not amused. This isn't funny, he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. She completely disrespected me in front of the whole family. My dad raised an eyebrow. You mean the same family you've been disrespecting for years? Rachel, clearly embarrassed, tried to smooth things over. Look, I think everyone's just a little heated right now. Maybe we should all just take a step back and... No, Greg interrupted, glaring at her. I'm not letting this slide. She owes me an apology. At that, my dad's patience finally ran out. He stood up, his hands flat on the table. You want an apology? For what? For saying what we've all been thinking? Greg, the only reason you're even here is because of Rachel. And frankly, we've been putting up with your crap for way too long. Frank, my mom hissed, her eyes darting nervously between my dad and Greg. Let's not make this worse. Worse? Dad said, his voice rising. The only thing that's worse than Greg's behavior is how long we've tolerated it. He turned to Rachel. You know I love you, but this guy? He's poison, and it's about time someone called him out. Greg looked like he was about to combust. This is unbelievable, he said, his voice trembling. You people are unbelievable. At that point, my mom finally intervened. Why don't we take a break, she said, standing up and gesturing toward the kitchen. Rachel, Greg, why don't you two head out early? I think everyone needs some time to cool off. Rachel hesitated, torn between staying to defend Greg and avoiding further embarrassment. But Greg, still fuming, grabbed his jacket and stormed toward the door. You'll regret this, he muttered as he passed by. I doubt it, my dad replied dryly. Rachel gave me a pleading look before following Greg out. We'll talk later, she said softly, but I didn't respond. As soon as the door closed behind them, the room seemed to exhale. My grandfather poured himself another cup of coffee, my cousin grabbed a cupcake, and my dad sat back down with a satisfied sigh. Well, that was refreshing, he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. Later that evening, as we were cleaning up the dining room, my mom pulled me aside. Aaron, she said, her tone serious. You need to talk to Mia. About what? I asked, though I already had a feeling I knew where this was going. About apologizing, she said. I know Greg can be difficult, but what Mia said was harsh. Too harsh. I stared at her, incredulous. You want Mia to apologize to Greg? After everything he said to her, to all of us, for years? Not because she was wrong, my mom said quickly, but because it'll keep the peace. Rachel is going to dig her heels in if we don't try to smooth things over, and I don't want this tearing the family apart. Mom, I said, my voice firm, this isn't about keeping the peace. This is about holding Greg accountable for once in his life. If Rachel wants to stand by him, that's her choice, but Mia is not apologizing for speaking the truth. My mom sighed, clearly torn. I just don't want to lose Rachel. You're not losing her, I said gently. But if you keep enabling Greg, you might lose the rest of us. The next day, Rachel called me, and it was immediately clear that she was furious. I can't believe you're defending her, she said, skipping any kind of greeting. Defending who? I asked, feigning ignorance. Mia, she snapped. She had no right to say those things to Greg. She completely humiliated him. He humiliated himself, I replied. Mia just held up the mirror. Rachel let out an exasperated sigh. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You've all turned against him, and now you're trying to drag me down with him. Rachel, I said, keeping my voice calm, nobody turned against Greg. He alienated himself by treating everyone like garbage for years. Mia just finally said out loud what we've all been thinking. Well, if she doesn't apologize, we're not coming to Christmas, Rachel said, her voice trembling with anger. That's fine, I said. We're not spending Christmas with you anyway. That seemed to catch her off guard. What do you mean? It's our year to spend Christmas with Mia's mom, I explained. So it's not like it makes a difference. There was a long pause, and then Rachel said, "I can't believe this. You've all chosen her over me." "It's not about choosing," I said. "It's about not putting up with Greg's behavior anymore. If you can't see that, I don't know what else to tell you." She hung up on me, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of relief. The family was shifting, and for once, it wasn't bending to Greg's will. But I knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the beginning of the storm. Rachel wasn't the type to back down, not when she felt wronged, and certainly not when Greg's fragile ego was at stake. After our tense phone call, she turned her attention to Mom, launching into what I could only imagine was an hour-long tirade about how Mia had disrespected Greg and crossed the line. She humiliated him in front of everyone. Rachel ranted, according to Mom's exasperated retelling later that evening. She needs to apologize publicly at the next gathering, and she needs to admit she lied about the family hating Greg. When Mom relayed this demand to me, I couldn't hold back a laugh. Does she seriously think we're going to pretend we like Greg? After everything he's pulled? Mom sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. "You know how Rachel is," she said. "In her mind, this isn't about Greg. It's about loyalty. She sees this as everyone choosing Mia over her." "Well, yeah," I said bluntly, "because Mia's not the problem. Greg is." Rachel didn't stop with Mom. Over the next 2 days, she made it her mission to rally support from anyone who would listen. She called my grandparents our cousins, even an old family friend who hadn't attended a gathering in years. Her story was always the same. Mia had gone too far, Greg was unfairly attacked, and the family was turning against them. Most people listened politely, but Rachel didn't get the reaction she was hoping for. Almost everyone she called reached out to me or Dad afterward, asking for the full story. When I explained what had actually happened, that Greg had insulted Mia's grief and she'd finally snapped, the general response was some variation of, "Well, it's about time someone said something." By the end of the week, the consensus among the family was clear. Greg had it coming, and Mia was the hero nobody knew they needed. But Greg wasn't going to take the loss lying down. First, he started texting my dad. At first, the messages were relatively tame. Accusations of favoritism, complaints about how Dad hadn't defended him during the argument. But as the days went on, the texts became more aggressive. "This family has a toxicity problem," one message read, "and Mia is the source. She's poisoning everyone against me." Another message demanded a serious conversation about the future of family gatherings. "We need to establish boundaries," Greg wrote, starting with an apology from Mia. Dad ignored the first few messages, rolling his eyes every time his phone buzzed. "I'm too old for this nonsense," he muttered, tossing his phone onto the kitchen counter. But then Greg sent a voice note. The note was a nearly 3-minute rant about how the family had allowed Mia's behavior to spiral out of control and how Dad, as the patriarch, had a responsibility to put her in her place. Greg's voice grew more frantic as the recording went on, accusing Dad of enabling a toxic environment and claiming that if the family didn't correct course, he and Rachel would have no choice but to cut ties. Dad listened to the message in silence, his face an unreadable mask. When it ended, he let out a slow breath and said, "Well, I guess we're at the threats stage now. What are you going to do?" I asked, half expecting him to brush it off again. "I'm going to respond," Dad said, standing up and grabbing his phone. Greg answered on the first ring, his voice immediately defensive. "I'm glad you called," he began, but Dad cut him off. "Save it, Greg," Dad said, his tone sharper than I'd heard in years. "I've heard enough. Frank, I don't think you're understanding." "No, you're not understanding," Dad interrupted. "You're the problem here. Not Mia. Not the rest of the family. You've been a thorn in everyone's side for years, and we've put up with it for Rachel's sake. But now, I'm done." Greg tried to interject, but Dad steamrolled over him. "You want boundaries? Fine. Here's one. Stop harassing my family. And while you're at it, grow up and take some accountability for once in your life. You wouldn't know respect if it hit you in the face, so don't start demanding it now." Greg's stunned silence on the other end of the line was almost comical. "Anything else you need to get off your chest?" Dad asked, his tone icy. Greg finally sputtered, "You'll regret this. Rachel and I don't care," Dad said, cutting him off again. "Goodbye, Greg." He hung up and set his phone down with a satisfied thud. That night, Mom tried once more to play mediator. "Frank, do you really think cutting them off is the answer?" she asked hesitantly. "They're cutting themselves off," Dad replied. "And honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing." I couldn't argue with him. Greg had been driving a wedge through the family for years, and Rachel's refusal to see it was enabling his behavior. If they wanted to isolate themselves, that was their choice. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. Rachel wasn't one to admit defeat, and Greg, he thrived on conflict. The real storm was still brewing. The fallout from the family lunch continued to spread like wildfire, and Rachel was fanning the flames. The next weekend, she called my mom yet again, this time with even more venom in her voice. "You're choosing Mia over your own daughter," Rachel accused, her words sharp and biting. "How could you betray me like this?" Mom, who had been trying desperately to mediate between all sides, was visibly cracking under the pressure. When she called me afterward, her voice was shaky. "I just want the family to be happy again," she said, the weariness evident in her tone. "Why does it have to be like this? Why can't everyone just get along?" "It's not you, Mom," I reassured her, though I knew it wouldn't erase her guilt. "This isn't your fault. This is about Rachel enabling Greg's behavior. If they can't take responsibility for the chaos they cause, that's on them, not you." The tension wasn't just affecting Mom. The rest of the family, who had been watching the drama unfold from the sidelines, was starting to take sides, and not in the way Rachel or Greg had hoped. Grandpa, who rarely gets involved in family conflicts, finally reached his breaking point. He called me one evening, his normally steady voice tinged with frustration. "Your grandmother and I talked," he began. "We've decided we're spending Christmas with your uncle this year." I was surprised. Grandpa and Grandma almost always came to my parents' house for Christmas. "Is everything okay?" I asked cautiously. "We're fine," he said firmly. "But we're done walking on eggshells around Greg. We don't want to deal with his attitude, and frankly, we're tired of Rachel making excuses for him." Hearing that felt bittersweet. On one hand, it was validating to know that even the more neutral members of the family were siding with us. On the other, it drove home just how fractured things had become. Rachel, meanwhile, was doubling down. After her call with Mom, she started reaching out to other relatives, framing the situation as a personal betrayal. "They've all turned against me," she claimed, conveniently ignoring the fact that her loyalty to Greg was the real issue. I heard about one particularly heated phone call she had with one of our cousins, Emma, who had been trying to stay out of the drama. Rachel apparently accused Emma of picking sides, simply because Emma hadn't reached out to her in the days following the infamous lunch. Emma, who normally has the patience of a saint, finally snapped. "I'm not picking sides," she told Rachel. "But if I were, it wouldn't be yours. Greg has been awful to everyone for years, and you've been enabling him. Maybe it's time to take a good look at why so many people are fed up." Rachel hung up on her, of course. Mom, caught in the middle of it all, was growing more and more distraught. She called me again a few days later, her voice on the verge of tears. "I just don't know what to do," she admitted. "Rachel's my daughter, but I can't defend Greg anymore. And now your grandparents are pulling away, and the family feels like it's falling apart." I could feel her heartbreak through the phone, and it crushed me. "Mom," I said gently, "the family isn't falling apart. It's just changing. People are setting boundaries because they're tired of being hurt. That's not a bad thing. But Rachel thinks I've abandoned her," Mom said. "She said I'm choosing Mia over her." "You're not choosing one over the other," I said firmly. "You're choosing peace over chaos. And honestly, that's what this family needs right now." Mom didn't respond right away, but I could tell my words had struck a chord. Meanwhile, Greg wasn't staying quiet. After his confrontation with my dad, he started reaching out to extended family members, spinning his own version of events. According to him, he was a victim of an orchestrated smear campaign, led by Mia and supported by everyone else. Most people didn't buy it. By now, Greg's reputation was well established, and Mia's comments at the lunch had only solidified what many already felt. But a few relatives, either out of loyalty to Rachel or a desire to keep the peace, tried to play devil's advocate. "Maybe Mia was too harsh," one aunt said to me during a phone call. "I mean, Greg isn't perfect, but does he really deserve to be ostracized like this?" I kept my response measured. Mia wasn't too harsh, she was honest. And Greg isn't being ostracized because of what she said. He's being held accountable for years of bad behavior. If he wants to change that, it's up to him. The aunt sighed, clearly unsatisfied with my answer, but didn't press further. As Christmas drew closer, the lines in the sand became clearer. Mom, though still torn, started to see the futility of trying to please everyone. "I've spent years bending over backward to keep this family together," she said one evening. "And what has it gotten me? More stress and less happiness." "You deserve better, Mom," I told her. For once, she seemed to believe it. But Rachel and Greg? They were gearing up for one final attempt to drag everyone down with them. And it was about to get messy. The breaking point wasn't some dramatic family gathering or carefully planned confrontation. It came quietly, in the form of a phone call. When I saw Rachel's name flash on my screen, I hesitated. After weeks of her accusations and Greg's constant meddling, I was exhausted. But part of me hoped this time might be different. It wasn't. "Are you happy now?" Rachel spat the moment I answered, skipping any semblance of a greeting. "You've turned the whole family against me and Greg. You're destroying everything." Her words were venomous, and her tone was laced with desperation. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Rachel, nobody turned the family against you. People are just tired of Greg's behavior, and you refusing to hold him accountable doesn't help." "Oh, spare me the self-righteous crap," she snapped. "This isn't about Greg. This is about you and Mia thinking you're better than everyone else." Well, newsflash, you're not. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I tried to keep my composure. "Rachel, this isn't productive. If you're willing to have a real conversation." "A real conversation?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "You mean where you talk, and I just listen to how awful Greg and I are?" "No thanks." I was about to respond when she said something that stopped me cold. "You and Mia think you're so perfect, but you're just a couple of deeks playing house with a kid who isn't even yours. Ben's nothing but the product of a rear, and everyone knows it." I felt the blood drain from my face. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. When I finally found my voice, it was cold and steady. "Rachel," I said, "this conversation is over." And then I hung up. For several minutes, I paced the room, my hands shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. Rachel had always had a sharp tongue, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. Once I calmed down enough to think clearly, I made a decision. I was done. No more trying to mediate, no more giving her the benefit of the doubt. I blocked her number and sent a message to the family group chat, explaining exactly what she had said. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Grandma, who rarely raises her voice or takes sides in family disputes, called Rachel directly. "You are dead to this family until you apologize and leave Greg," she told her, according to my mom. "I will not have that kind of hatred in this family, especially not directed at Aaron, Mia, or Ben." My dad, who had already been on the verge of cutting ties with Rachel and Greg, took it one step further. When Greg called him yet again, probably to try and smooth things over, Dad didn't hold back. "You're the worst thing to ever happen to Rachel," Dad said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "You've dragged this family through hell for 8 years, and we're done. Don't call me again." Greg tried to argue, but Dad hung up before he could get a word in. Even my mom, who had been Rachel's staunchest defender throughout this entire ordeal, finally reached her breaking point. She called me later that evening, her voice heavy with sadness. "I can't support this anymore," she admitted. "I love Rachel, but she's made her choice, and now I have to make mine. I'm not going to let her hurt this family any longer." As Christmas approached, the family dynamic shifted in ways I never thought possible. My grandparents, who had always tried to remain neutral, openly distanced themselves from Rachel and Greg. My cousins, aunts, and uncles followed suit, each of them reaching out to express their support for me and Mia. And then there was Mom. For years, she had bent over backward to keep the peace, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of family harmony. But now she seemed freer, lighter, as if shedding the weight of Rachel's drama had allowed her to breathe again. She called me a few days before Christmas, her voice resolute. "I've decided I'm spending Christmas at Mia's mom's house," she said. "It's time for a fresh start." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You're always welcome with us, Mom," I said softly. "I know," she replied. "And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm making the right choice." Rachel, predictably, didn't take the news well. She tried to reach out through various family members, spinning her usual narrative of betrayal and victimhood. But by then, nobody was buying it. The truth was out, and Rachel and Greg were left with nothing but the consequences of their own actions. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The chaos they had brought to our family was finally starting to dissipate, and while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew we were moving in the right direction. Because sometimes breaking points aren't the end. They're the beginning of something better. Christmas morning felt different right from the start. The air was crisp and quiet, with none of the underlying tension that usually accompanied family gatherings. For the first time in years, there were no whispered warnings to keep the peace or subtle reminders to not let Greg get under your skin. Instead, the house was filled with the scent of freshly baked cinnamon rolls and the sound of Ben giggling as Mia helped him unwrap the toy truck we bought him. His joy was infectious, and even the normally reserved adults couldn't help but smile. Mia's mom had joined us for the day, her warmth and humor making everyone feel at ease. She and my mom, who had recently begun to rebuild their relationship after years of polite but distant interactions, were sitting in the kitchen sharing mulled wine and exchanging recipes. The sight of them laughing together felt like a small but significant victory. As the day unfolded, I couldn't help but notice how peaceful everything felt. There were no forced smiles or stilted conversations. No walking on eggshells or bracing for the next cutting remark. Mia and my dad, as usual, spent part of the afternoon bantering about everything from football to his latest car restoration project. Their dynamic had always been one of mutual respect and shared humor, but without Greg around to derail the conversation, it felt more natural, more genuine. Even my mom, who had spent weeks agonizing over her decision to join us instead of Rachel, seemed lighter. She laughed easily, her shoulders relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. At one point, she pulled me aside, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and gratitude. "I think I made the right decision," she said softly. "This feels good, better than I thought it would." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You deserve this." That's not to say Rachel wasn't on my mind. Throughout the day, I caught myself thinking about her, the version of her from before Greg entered the picture. The sister who used to sneak me into concerts when I was too young to go on my own, who spent hours helping me pick out the perfect engagement ring for Mia, and who for a brief moment I thought might be my maid of honor. But that version of Rachel felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone I barely recognized. The Rachel who stood by Greg, no matter how badly he treated the family, who lashed out when she didn't get her way, and who said things I never thought she was capable of. I felt the ache of her absence, but it wasn't the kind of loss that ruined the day. Instead, it was a quiet acknowledgement of what could have been. Mia, ever attuned to my moods, caught me staring out the window at one point, lost in thought. She walked over, sliding her arm around my waist and resting her head on my shoulder. "You can't save her, love," she said gently, her voice filled with understanding. "She has to want to save herself." She was right, of course. Rachel had made her choice, and so had I. My focus now was on the family I had built, Mia, Ben, and the life we were creating together. As the day wound down, the house filled with the sound of laughter and playful arguments over which Christmas movie to watch. Ben, riding the high of a sugar rush from too many holiday treats, was adamant about the Polar Express, while Mia tried to sell him on Elf. I sat back, watching them with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Letting go of Rachel and Greg hadn't been easy, but as I looked around the room, I realized it wasn't the loss I'd feared it would be. It was a gain of peace, of clarity, and of the chance to build a better future, one free of the drama and toxicity that had weighed us down for so long. This was the family that mattered, the one that laughed together, supported each other, and celebrated each other's joy without condition or ulterior motives. As Mia flopped onto the couch beside me, pretending to pout when Ben declared the Polar Express the winner, I couldn't help but smile. "Good choice, buddy," I said, ruffling Ben's hair as he beamed at me. Mia rolled her eyes but leaned into me, her head resting against my shoulder. "Merry Christmas, Aaron," she said softly. "Merry Christmas, Mia," I replied, wrapping an arm around her. And for the first time in a long time, it truly felt like it.